Please rise.
Flag of the United States of America, and to the republic which stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Pursuant to the Public Act, Chapter 231, Public Law of 1975, this meeting is sent to the Adequacy Press on October 12, 2021, and has been duly advertised in the Adequacy Press issue of October 14, 2021. All municipal clerks of the townships and the boroughs within the regional high school district have been duly notified, and the requirements of this posting has been met on October 12, 2021. Mr. Toscano, any changes to the agenda?
Yes, Mr. President. In addition to the items, the items noted on the agenda, the board also discussed the following additional items in executive session. In box number 8, the board discussed an additional personnel issue. For exception number 1, the board discussed student discipline matters. And in exception number 7, in addition to the settlement agreements, the board discussed the matter under docket number EDS-09496-21. And again, these matters were just not listed on the agenda when it was printed earlier in the week.
Is that all, Mr. Toscano?
Yes, that's all.
Do I have a motion to approve the minutes of February 10th, 2022, the regular board meeting?
Move. Second.
I think it was Ms. Higley for the second.
Yes.
Roll call, please. Any discussion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Cappiello,
Yes.
Mrs. Higley,
Yes.
Mrs. Lavin,
Yes.
Mr. Messinger,
Yes.
Mrs. Spinelli,
Yes.
Mrs. Bruno,
Yes.
Mr. Parisi,
Yes.
Mr. Bruno.
Yes, sir. Just a reminder, the communications are on file in the office of the board secretary. Dr. Sampson, are you ready for your report?
Sure. First part of my report, I will defer to Mr. Boyce to introduce our auditor, John Swisher.
Yes, so tonight is the board's acceptance of the audit report for fiscal year ended June 2021. I'll invite Mr. Swisher to the podium to introduce himself and walk the board through it.
Thank you very much, Sean. My name is John Swisher. I'm a partner with the firm of Suppley Clooney Company, excuse me, and I am here to talk about the report dated June 30th, 2021. For those of you that have heard this before, we're usually here a lot earlier. The report is usually due December 5th. This year, as in the previous year, it was delayed because we were waiting for certain information from the state Division of Pensions for numbers that had to be included in your report. As a result, the Department of Education changed the due date from December 5th to March 15th, which you'll be in compliance with. The report is actually already filed electronically down with them. But to take a step back for a second, the purpose of the audit, your audit is required by law. Each school district in the state of New Jersey is required to appoint an independent outside auditor to look at their financial statements. And the purpose of that is for us to express an opinion on the financial statements and whether they're free from material misstatement. And that basically means we're going into your business office, looking at the financial records, testing the account balances in the transaction, and then issuing an opinion on those financial statements so that you can have faith in them. You can have faith in them, the public can have faith in them, a lending agency can have faith in them. That's basically the basis of the audit. This year, things are a little bit different. I've been doing this for over 35 years. I probably don't look like it. But they did change some things up this year. So when you look at your report and compare it to the previous year, the first thing you will notice is that there was a new name. In the past, it was a CAFR, Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. That has now been changed to an ACFR, Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, or an ACFR. So when you hear me use that terminology, I'm referring to the large report that you usually get. The previous name, it turns out, was a bad word in South Africa. And so they changed it. They reversed the two letters. So when you see the report and you look at the front of the report, it's not a typo. It's actually there. It's an adverb. So you have to get used to a little bit to the new terminology. Secondly, GASB, the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, changed things up on us regarding some of the funds in the financial statements, the fiduciary funds, the trust funds that you have, for instance, your student activities as an example. And basically they reclassified these funds so that there's no longer a fiduciary section. Those funds are still in the report, but they're shown in different funds. So if you're looking at the report year to year, it may be a little bit confusing. There is a guide in the notes to the financial statements that should guide you through that. If you have any issues with it whatsoever, you can of course talk to Mr. Boyce, and if he needs my assistance, I can come back and talk you through that as well. Thirdly, they changed the percentage of excess surplus. Excess surplus is a thing that's invented by the Department of Education, and it talks about being able to keep a certain amount of money within your financial statements, the rest going back as quote-unquote tax relief. It's usually been 2%, probably for the last at least 10 years, maybe 12 years. For the year ended June 30th, 21 and June 30th, 22, it's being expanded to 4%. The reason for this is because you're seeing these federal funds flow through your financial statements, the ESSER money, the digital divide money, the pandemic aid is flowing through. So you're going to be allowed to keep a little bit more as this money flows through your district for 21 and for 22. Subsequent to that, it will go back to, we're being told, it will go back to the 2%. So three things that have kind of changed a little bit year to year if you're comparing the two reports. So the results of our audit. As I talked about before, we have to render this opinion on the financial statements. And what you're looking for is an unmodified opinion. We were able to do all of our testing and our procedures and say that the financial statements are free from material misstatement. You did get an unmodified opinion. That's the best opinion you can get. Most school districts do get an unmodified opinion, but still, it's really what you strive for. It gives you the ability to truly rely on the financial statements. The second opinion in the report regards internal controls and compliance. Internal controls are the internal rules that you have within the district to process the transactions. For instance, a purchase order and the various signatures and approvals that are required on that purchase order to put it through the system. So we look at those controls, we make sure that they're suitably designed to make sure the transactions are reported properly, or whether there might be fraud occurring. Once we deem them to be suitable, we then test them to make sure you're actually doing those procedures. And I'm happy to say that we were able to do our procedures and they were good, okay? Secondly, compliance. We live in the state of New Jersey and there's a lot of laws and regulations. I use the example of bids. You award bids to various vendors. And there's rules and regulations that go along with bidding. So we'll pull some bids as example, and we'll test them to make sure you did the proper procedures. Payroll is another area where there's a ton of compliance. And we performed certain tests on that. Again, with compliance, clean. So we're doing good so far, clean in the financial statements, clean on internal controls, clean on compliance. There's a third opinion. The third opinion regards the single audit. The single audit is when you go over $750,000 in expenditures for either federal or state programs. These are your grants. And most, like most districts, goes over $750,000 in both federal and state, so you have a single audit in both areas. This basically means that once you go over this threshold, we actually have to do additional testing. We have to go through these programs, Title I, IDA, National School Lunch, etc., and pick one or two of the programs. We rotate them around, and we're required to do compliance that's set to us by the federal government or by the state government. This year was a little bit different because, of course, you have this new federal money flowing through. And so those, since there are new programs, are deemed to be riskier, so we look at those programs. The good news is we were able to look at them, and again, we didn't find any issues with the compliance that was set forth by the federal government on it. That's good news because there's a lot of money flowing through and you should have confidence that it's being spent correctly. So 3 for 3, okay? 3 opinions, and there are no issues in any of those. As a result, the smaller of the 2 reports received, the auditor's management report, which again is required by the Department of Education, and in that report they kind of asked us to look at various areas of compliance, payroll, purchasing, capital assets. You would see a comment and recommendation in that report if I had any issues with those 3 opinions I just spoke about. Since we have no issues with the opinions, we have no issues with the management reports, and that is clear as well. So it's good news this evening. I'll end talking a little bit about the financial position of the district. We're in good shape at the end of the year. Most districts, or from those 38 districts across the state, are seeing an increase in their fund balance at the end of the year. And this is generally speaking due to the fact that you do have this federal money flowing through, and as a result of having remote learning, certain expenses go down as well. So good news. But I'm telling all my districts, we had some really good talks about the fact that we're going to get back to the new normal. We'll all be without masks, thank God. But although you had a good year this year, you can't expect that in the future. So you should remain conservative. Conservative is the word I would use to describe this. You should be very conservative with your budgeting, with your finances, which is good. But you really want to be aware of that, particularly in this odd pandemic era that we're going to look back on eventually. Things will change. The last thing that I'll say is this ACFR that you put together. The district does it. The business office does that. 38 school districts. We have one school district that actually puts the financial statements together for us and hands the report to us. And that's important, okay? Other districts, they require our assistants to put together the financial statements. Here it's given to me, and that's really a tribute to your business office staff. They do a fine job, and it's a really high level of accounting that you have here. So you should be very proud of that. So you're going to get the 2 reports. They're already filed with the state. Okay, you're already in compliance. There's a lot of information, certainly. And as you go through them, certainly I'll stop right now and answer for questions. But if you don't have questions this evening and you need me to come back anytime, I can do that as well. Or I'll stop right now and take any questions on any of the things I've spoken about so far. Hearing none. Again, I'll thank the business office staff. Remember, they're doing their day-to-day work, and we're coming in and auditing them. It can't be pleasant. We try our best to make it pleasant, but sometimes it's not. And they really treat us with professionalism is the word that I would use to describe the district. So it's really kind of a pleasure to come in. That's all I have today.
John, thank you very much for that report. I have just a couple comments on that. First, thanks to you and your crew for the professionalism that you show when conducting the audit, but also, and board, as you may know, and Dr. Sampson certainly knows, for the insight that you provide and the resource that you are to me throughout the school year, as we are in constant communication on new regulations and things that need to be implemented, but also, it's when your auditor has dozens of other school districts, they can glean some insight from there, and very often I'll bounce ideas off of John to see if he's experienced that in his past, and so that's very valuable to me. I don't get the opportunity to talk about the team in the business office. It is really a diligent group that works with purpose to provide a stable financial infrastructure for the operation of the district. They're thoughtful, but they're also adaptable to individual situations as they come up, and I appreciate that, and I'm sure the other administrators in the district appreciate working with them and how we can move through problems, situations smoothly, but still provide the right controls and compliance that are required. So I have an outstanding team, and I'm very thankful for that. One comment on, you had mentioned, and there are many things in this document to talk about, but one of the ones that you chose to mention tonight was this increase in the allowable percentage of surplus that a district can maintain. And I know that many districts that are on the good side of S2, which is, for those of you who don't know, state legislation that is cutting state aid for districts like Freehold Regional, we're not in the position where we are able to have that conservative approach anymore due to the compounding impact of considerable cuts year after year under S2. So with the adoption of the tentative budget tonight, I thought that it was worth mentioning that because of where we stand with state funding, the tolerance for risk as we run our operation needs to move up and up. And unfortunately, that's not a luxury that we can afford to maintain a surplus at 4%, because we're going to need it moving forward immediately. So, as you mentioned it, I thought it was a good opportunity just to drop that in as well.
You're making a good point, Sean. Like I said, although you did well financially here, because of the cuts in the state aid, you need to do well. And one of the examples I would point out would be your capital reserve, which I've spoken about in past meetings here, and the ability to kind of see that through capital projects. Since you are experiencing this reduction in state aid, it's hard to put money into that account to be able to deal with the day-to-day capital needs. And there's just really not a whole heck of a lot to do about that at this point in time. But it goes back and emphasizes my point about trying to remain conservative and understanding that these next 2 years, this year was a good year, I think next year should be okay, but you're still experiencing this impact of this reduction of state aid, and that's something that you really just can't do.
Well, if you can find a way for us to save $5 million again, John, without COVID, we're all ears.
You sound like my wife now. So I wish that I could, your district is experienced, we can list down the other districts that are in the same hole as you. It's interesting as things were said today in different districts, I'm getting phone calls from that are getting money. They happen to be in this district. I live in this district. So it is frustrating, because I know everybody here is dealing with it. But you're doing the best you can with what you have. That's all you're doing.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Again, if you have any questions at all, contact Sean. You can reach out to me.
Thank you, John.
Have a nice evening. Take care.
Dr. Sampson, will you continue with your report?
Yeah, and a few items. So just a perfect segue to the tentative budget, but thank you to Sean and Trish and the business office, and John is a terrific resource, not just for Sean but for myself as well. And I think it does. This district always prides itself on doing things beyond the norm, and the norm in 38 other districts is that they need their auditor to help them with the capital report, and that's not the case here. So I think that speaks volumes. Tentative budget is being adopted tonight, so state aid numbers were released today. It's late. The governor pushed back his budget address to coincide conveniently with the mask mandate being lifted. But so that address was on March 8th, and we got our numbers at about noon today. So a couple things to think about, and we always adopt the tentative budget is for all practical purposes just a formality tonight. Mr. Boyce will be working over the next six or 7 weeks to really put together the final budget. The board will receive their budget briefing a few weeks ahead of the final vote, and then we will have the public presentation at Howell High School on April 28th with the final budget. But a couple things of note. So we were anticipating a reduction of $6.7 million. The reduction that we did in fact receive was quote, and I use air quotes here, only $3.5 million. So for perspective, 2% on our tax levy is $2.8 million. So we're being cut $3.5 million, so we're already, for lack of a better term, in the hole. It's interesting, though, how that number was arrived at, and Sean did a terrific job today with Trish of diving right in. It's a sad state when you're excited that you only get cut $3.5 million, right? Trish came into the office with Sean and I today and was excited. And I think that's a terrible statement on the state of finance and K-12 education in the state of New Jersey, and I believe we might be the only state that's cutting any school districts at this time in recovering from COVID, especially with all the federal dollars that are flying around. I'll get to that in a moment. So a couple of the interesting points. We were curious as to how the state came up with that number, and while we're certainly appreciative of being cut less, still the question of how was that number arrived at. And so, this state is involved in litigation with the Department of Ed, and the intent behind that litigation was always to get the algorithm and the numbers for the funding formula so that we can make sense of it, so that we can understand it, so that we can see how the state arrives at their determination. And frankly, we've long thought for lack of a more complex way to say it, that they back into their numbers, right, in certain ways. And so we look today, and the multipliers that determine what your aid is, we looked at if the multiplier that they used this year was the same as last year, what would that have been for us? And what it would have been a reduction of 8.8 million. But the multiplier this year was different. Now, we don't know why. We don't know how. We have no idea how those numbers were even arrived at, which gets to the heart of our lawsuit of what we're trying to ascertain and how these numbers are developed. So again, we're happy that it's not 6.7 million because that allows us to breathe a bit. To John Swisher's point, the auditor, we saved $5 million when we were closed from March to June of 2020. District saved $5 million. That would have been direct cuts in the district, period. And we've received $9.9 million in federal funds, and it was a frustrating day for me as a superintendent as I spoke to a number of my colleagues who are not S2 districts and who couldn't believe how much more they were receiving than they anticipated. And so, while other districts across the state are flush, we're still being reduced $3.5 million. In a year that the state borrowed $4 billion, received billions more from the federal government, and have the audacity to cut some public schools. It's disgusting, period. And I'll be on NJ Spotlight at 10 a.m. tomorrow saying that as well, if anybody cares to hear it. A couple things that factored into where we arrived at that number as well. There's a 4% increase from year to year in the number of special needs students in the district, so that factors into, there's a formula for each student and they're weighted differently. And we had a 15% increase in what's designated as at-risk. I hate that term, but that's the term that's used, really tied to socioeconomic status. So a 15% increase across the district, which I think is significant. And those students are weighted differently in terms of the aid, right? I mean, in terms of what that looks like. And so that's one of the reasons why we suspect the hit is less. We plan to apply for stabilization aid once again. Last year, there was a $50 million budget line in the budget for stabilization aid for just S2 districts like ourselves. In the preliminary budget that the governor put forth, there's $20 million in there. So I'm hopeful that some of our local legislators have indicated that they would seek to have that number increased. And I'm hopeful that they're successful in that because we plan to certainly apply for that. We're also now, when I took over this district in 2011 as superintendent, we were slightly over $1 million or so. How much were we then, Sean? What was the number?
That's about right.
Yeah, over adequacy, right? And the adequacy budget is important. It's what the state says you should be funded at, right? It's that line. We're about $1 million over on almost a $200 million budget, right? So nothing extravagant, close to the line. We have now drifted to over $11 million under adequacy in this district. So we're $11 million below what the state determines is an adequate number to be at. And one of the pushes that we've made with the legislators in the state is that if you're under adequacy and your cost per pupil is lower than the state average, you should not be reduced, right? So our cost per pupil, we've said over and over again, is somewhere around, it's north of $3,000 per student less than the typical high school. So we're educating kids here for $3,000 or so less per pupil. We're $11 million under what the state says we should be at, and we're still being reduced this year, and we'll be reduced again next year. There's a commission that's been named to evaluate the funding formula. I'm hopeful that there's some change, over the next couple of years, because we have significant questions over the increase to what's known as our local fair share in relation to what our property wealth has actually increased in this region. Did I miss anything?
No, I think that captures it. The adequacy budget, just to clarify, is district specific, right? So it's based on your actual student population, and that's pushed through a cost formula. So it represents the amount of money necessary to provide a thorough and efficient education. So by definition, by the state's definition, here's the amount of money that a district needs, and it is a different number for every district, obviously, because the student population is different in every district. And being $11 million beneath that, we are, according to the funding formula, we do not have enough money to provide our 10,000 students with a thorough and efficient education. But what we do have going for us is an economy of scale, and I think our practices with what we choose to fund and how we go about implementing things speaks to the efficiencies that we do achieve. So the adequacy budget is really the important marker for determining whether or not a district is appropriately funded. The next part of that formula is, okay, how are we going to pay for it? And it's community first to the extent that they're able. That's the local fair share. And then whatever's left over is state aid. And as Dr. Sampson mentioned, the measure of a community's ability to pay is volatile in the funding formula from year over year. It's very unpredictable. It's without any sort of rhythm. And so as that number fluctuates, our state aid will fluctuate. But we've been to the bad on that calculation each year under the implementation of S2. And those are the details that we're seeking in our lawsuit, along with some other districts, to the state to determine exactly what is the methodology for figuring out what a community can afford to fund its own education. So I hope that helps with some clarification.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Boyce. And then just a couple other points. We also, as a high school only district, our parents, right, and our students are with us for 4 years at a time. And, S2 has extended beyond that 4-year experience. And so it's also increasingly difficult for us to continue to communicate the need and the sense of urgency that's really there. And the unfortunate reality is that, we've been incredibly vocal and out front for years about this issue, but not all of our parents still even know it, incoming 9th grade parents. And we don't take that for granted in terms of communicating with them. But I do think it potentially lends to the element of surprise when certain things, are no longer available. And that's something that our communities will have to work through. A couple other updates. I'd be remiss if I didn't state it's nice to have everybody here unmasked. The mask mandate was lifted on March 7th. It's been very quiet in the schools. We made sure to communicate to respect everybody's decision about whether they wore masked or not. Haven't had, it's been quiet. And we're hopeful that continues, and certainly always cautiously optimistic when it comes to that. Next week, in another phenomenal decision, the state has gone through with standardized testing and tied that to a graduation requirement and a test known as the NJGPA, which is interesting. And John came up as the auditor, and that might be the only line of work that has more acronyms than education, as far as I've seen it. But it's the New Jersey Graduation Proficiency Assessment. We've gone back to sort of that, what the HESPA used to be, a one-stop shopping for juniors. But it is a high-stakes test, and it's more difficult than the HESPA was. And particularly the math section is more difficult. There's a lot of questions around what the cut scores mean and how they're arrived at and what this means for students. And there's a number of us that are really fearful that this will just be a self-fulfilling prophecy. That look at these kids, they struggled, look at all this learning loss, but in fact the test is actually harder than what the HESPA used to be. And a lot of agitation around it. From a scheduling standpoint, we were frustrated that we had to disrupt the days to test the juniors because we want to give our juniors the best opportunity to do well on this assessment. It's important. And we could have clomped on 2 tests a day, but that would have had them sitting for 3 hours taking a graduation assessment, and we thought that the most effective way to guarantee their success was to do 1 test a day over a 4-day period for 90 minutes. Any adult in this room, if you've sat and taken a 90-minute test, we'd probably all be a little bit fatigued at that point and wouldn't want to go take another 90-minute one. But what that does is it disrupts our schedule a little bit, just when we're back in the swing of a regular schedule, right? So there's some difficulty there that I don't think was thought through. We'll see where the state decides to go with it. There is an awful lot of pressure from every single major educational group in the state to back off of this assessment. And we'll see if the policymakers and the State Board of Ed actually raised the cut score, even though the Department of Ed had suggested 725, the State Board of Ed raised it to 750. I'm not sure that anybody on that body could even tell me how you arrive at either one of those numbers, but they voted for it. And the folks who I have a daughter who's a junior, right, who's got to sit for the test. And I think it's just it's a really difficult, it makes no sense at all to talk about how much kids are struggling as we emerge from COVID and then to put a high stakes graduation assessment right on top of them on the back end of the 3rd year in a row that they've had disrupted due to COVID. So we'll be initiating that next week, though, from the 14th to the 17th with a partial day schedule.
Thank you. We have 2 board reports tonight. We have policy. Diane Capiello, you want to give her your policy report?
So policy committee met on Thursday, March 3rd. Mr. Mendez, Dr. Hazel, Dr. Sampson, Mrs. Bruno, myself, and Mr. Lupino, who's one of our community members, met. The policies that I'm going to give you a synopsis for are on for first reading today, and then we'll be on for second reading next board meeting. Okay, policy 2415.05. It's a mandatory policy that addresses the issue of school districts administering student surveys, analysis, evaluation, examination, testing, or treatment funded in whole or in part by a program of the United States Department of Education and outlines federal regulations. I should preface by saying that many of the policies that I'm going to go through, we updated our policy manual, but these were practices for the most part that we were already in place in the district, so there was no real major changes needed to be made to how things were operating. Policy and Regulation 2431.4 is mandatory and has been rewritten to address the revisions for the prevention and treatment of sports-related concussions and head injuries, which expanded the scope of the law to include intramural sports, interscholastic sports, and cheerleading programs. It requires school districts to implement the graduated 6-step return to competition process developed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And like I said, these are things that have been in place and have always been very important to the district, but we updated our policy. Regulation 2460.30 is a new and mandatory regulation. It was developed to address the provisions of the recently passed state law regarding additional compensatory special education and related services. This statute was enacted in response to the COVID pandemic, and it applies to students with disabilities who exceed or will exceed the current age of eligibility for special ed and related services, which is currently 21 years, in the 2020-2021 school year, 2021 and 22-23 school years. So some of these students are entitled to an additional year of education, is the bottom line. Policy and Regulation 2622 are mandatory, and they outline the New Jersey State Board of Education recently adopted revisions regarding standards and assessments. All students at grade level 3 through 12 and at any other grade designated by the Commissioner shall take all appropriate assessments as scheduled, hence the testing next week. Policy 3233 and 4233 provide guidelines to teaching and support staff members regarding political activities on school grounds. These are updated terms in the policy. Board of Chosen Freeholders is now the Board of County Commissions, and freeholder and chosen freeholder shall now be County Commissioner. And the word premises has been replaced by school grounds, and pupils has been replaced by students. So it's really just a matter of different language for the same thing. Policy 321 and 4321 was reviewed and outlines acceptable use of computer networks, computers, and resources by teaching staff members and support staff members. Policy 5460, high school graduation. This is a mandatory policy. It reflects the adopted revision from the New Jersey State Board of Education and was revised to include updated language to provide greater clarity regarding the graduation assessment requirements for the classes of 23, 24, and 25. Policy 5541, anti-hazing, is a new mandatory policy. This new law requires public high schools and middle schools to adopt an anti-hazing policy. The statute outlines the appropriate penalties for violation of the district's anti-hazing policy. And hazing allegations may very often implicate Policy Guide 5512, harassment, intimidation, and bullying. And there may need to be a separate investigation to address the requirements. Policy and Regulation 8465 has been revised and requires all bias-related incidents to be reported to local law enforcement and the county prosecutor, which is interesting. You now need to, in that instance, also, we need to notify the county prosecutor, not just the local law enforcement. Gender identity or expression and national origin has been added to the protected class of individuals for bias intimidation. Additionally, school property has been revised to school grounds. Policy Guide 9560, administration of school surveys, is mandatory. The new state statute addresses anonymous and voluntary provisions regarding school surveys. And policies can always be found online. They're very accessible for parents in our website under policies.
Good job, thank you so much. And next is finance.
Mr. Messenger, you ready?
Yes. Okay, on March 1st, we had a finance committee meeting. Most of the meeting was with our guest speaker, who was Mike Morrow from Brown & Brown, the district's insurance broker. And we learned a lot. It was very informative. With respect to health benefits, it's very important to this board since 20% of our budget, or roughly $37 million, is spent on employee benefits, and most of that is health benefits. So we had a discussion of the influence of the law, bargaining between the district and the labor units, and our decision to move to full funding, and how this all influences health insurance rates. And there's a ton of different moving parts, as you can imagine, in the health insurance business. And as you also can imagine, the healthcare costs are going up significantly. Even though inflation might be 7%, we all know that healthcare costs are going to certainly exceed that. There are three health plans offered by this district. There's direct access, there's the traditional plan, and there's the educator's health plan. I'm trying to whittle this down, so bear with me. Okay. One of the other things about health insurance in this district is that if the employee has health insurance through their spouse, it does save the district money. So we do give waivers for there where employees are, do get a percentage of the cost savings. So we learned all about that, how much those waivers are, percentages, etc., what percentage of the employees get waivers. And then we had a long discussion about state law. Chapter 44 became law back in July of 2020, and it required school districts to provide two different health care plans. One is known as Garden State Health Plan, which isn't in existence yet, and then there's the Educator's Health Plan. And all new employees have to go into the Educator's Health Plan. During this discussion, we also learned about the history of employee contributions. Employees were required to pay 15% of their salary for their health care, but as things continued to go up in cost, that had to change because it was getting to be way too expensive for the employees. So getting back to Educator's Health Plan, since all new hires have to go into it, that plan is getting more and more members. Now, supposedly this is all supposed to save money, this Chapter 44 that was passed. Now, the state is going to be doing an audit in 2023 to see if, in fact, the $330 million in cost savings is realized. As I said, that Garden State Health Plan, which is required by the state, that plan does not offer coverage outside the state of New Jersey, so I think when we look at the future, that probably is not going to be taken up by that many employees because you're not allowed to leave the state of New Jersey to get reimbursed. Also with that Educator's Health Plan that all the new employees go to, over time the contribution by the employee goes down, so that should be pretty popular. One of the big things that we have to look at, and this has been discussed over the past year, is that this district has gone to self-insurance, where we actually pay the claims. Horizon processes the claims, and they get paid for the administrative work that they do, and they are the reinsurer, but essentially Freehold Regional is the insurer here. And a big selling point of that was savings on premium tax, because New Jersey taxed premium payments that we paid. And also one of the things about this is that there is a reinsurer. Well, as I said, Blue Cross is the Horizon is the reinsurer. So it's not like if catastrophe happens and there's $1 billion in healthcare costs, Freehold Regional is going to have to pay that. There is a limit, a cap on how much this district will have to pay in healthcare costs. But there are risks to that, because with self-insurance, there is a risk that the district does assume a portion of the health risk of the employees. If you have an unforeseen spike in utilization, we could see an increased spike in healthcare costs in any particular year. But up to this point, the trends are below average. So far, everything is okay on that front. The last slide we saw from the guest speaker was about current claims cost, and we saw a chart on the amount of medical claims the district has paid out. The claims, as I said, are on the right track as of late, and have been roughly flat since people have come back to work post-COVID. As you could all imagine, the claims nosedived during COVID as everyone stayed home and didn't go to the doctor. But there hasn't been a rapid increase, so that's been very, very good. And just in terms of the overall picture, I talked about the fact that we're a self-insurer. So just so you know, the claims that we pay are 90% of the costs, and that administrative cost that I referenced with respect to Horizon, that represents about 10% of our total costs. So that was the presentation we had on healthcare costs. The two other items we talked about were approving the tentative budget, which is in H5. That was talked about how Mr. Boyce and the district just received the state budget funding the other day. And lastly, you will see on I-1 and I-2, the bids for roofing and paving are on the agenda. So with respect to the roofing, a total of 5 contractors submitted bids for the roofing projects at Freehold Township and Marlboro. And with respect to paving, there was a total of 7 contractors submitted bids at the 4 schools that are not receiving roofing this year. So those were the 3 items that we talked about back on March 1st.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, we have no one for public participation tonight. Okay, so we're going to go skip through public participation, and we're going to go to, may I have a motion to take G1?
Mr. Bruno? Mr. Bruno,
I'm sorry.
there's some additions.
Yeah,
Okay,
so,
Mr.
on the back table, there were 3 items that on the agenda online noted that resolution will be brought to the meeting. So there's the yellow paper on the back table there, but to fill in those blanks, one of them was H5, adoption of the 2022-23 tentative budget. As we received our state aid numbers today, we were able to complete that resolution, and also the awards, as Mr. Messinger just noted, for roofing and paving work this coming summer. They were received last Thursday, and we're under review all the way up through today before the final awards could be determined. So that's up on the table. In addition, there's a darker yellow piece of paper up there for addendum to existing agenda items. G2, approval of retirements. It's the addition of Eli Reich, computer technician, Colts Neck High School, effective date June 30th, 2022. Years of service, 15 years and 10 months. So a long-time employee of us. And also G13, approval of substitute home instruction personnel. This is Janet Campagna, a home instructor, teacher effective tomorrow, March 11th, 2022. So those are additional items on existing resolutions to be considered on tonight's vote.
I was just going to skip right through all those important things.
Yeah, that's right.
Jesus, I'm glad you stopped me. Okay, let's take G. May I have a motion to approve G1 through G16?
Motion.
Second.
And Mrs. Capiello, a second. Discussion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Capiello?
Yes on everything except G16, and on that I abstain.
Mrs. Higley?
Yes on everything but G16, which I abstain.
Mrs. Lavin?
Yes.
Mr. Messinger?
Yes.
Mrs. Finelli?
Yes.
Mrs. Bruno?
Yes.
Mr. Parisi?
Yes.
Mr. Bruno?
Yes on everything except G16.
Is that abstention?
Abstain from G16. I'm abstaining. Yep. We're going to take H1 through I2. It's program operations, building, transportation, and the physical plant. H1 through I2. May I have a motion?
Move.
Mr. Parisi, may I have a second?
Second.
Mrs. Dillon? Any discussion? Hearing no discussion, roll call, please.
Mrs. Capiello?
Yes.
Mrs. Higley?
Yes.
Mrs. Lavin?
Yes.
Mr. Messinger?
Yes.
Mrs. Finelli?
Yes.
Mrs. Bruno?
Yes.
Mr. Parisi?
Yes.
Mr. Bruno?
Yes. We're going to take J1 through K3. It's educational programs and administration. J1 through K3. May I have a motion?
Move.
Mrs. Capiano. Second? I have to have a second.
Second.
Mrs. Higley, second. Any discussion? Hearing no discussion, roll call.
Mrs. Capello,
Yes on everything except K1, I abstain from Dr. Hazel.
Mrs. Higley,
Yes.
Mrs. Lavin,
Yes.
Mr. Messinger,
Yes.
Mrs. Finelli,
Yes.
Mrs. Bruno,
Yes.
Mr. Parisi,
Yes, but I abstain on J11 and J19.
Mr. Bruno.
Yes.
Motion's carried.
Okay, anyone have old business to discuss under L, old business? Any members? Any discussion on old business? Okay. New business? Any new business? Any members would like to discuss new business tonight?
Yes, Mr. President.
Yes.
Okay. Over the last 10 years or so, whenever a teacher I had retired or unfortunately passed away, I've tried to convey how so many of the teachers that I had and my classmates and my kids had in this district remain with you for so many decades to come. I just wanted to pass on an email I got recently from a girl who was a classmate of my son in the class of 2018 at Marlboro. And I really think that at Marlboro, Mr. McGow and Mr. Hawk need to be recognized because this girl is applying to grad school. So she's been out of Marlboro High School for 4 years. And the whole purpose of our email is to tell the board the gratitude and appreciation she has for these two teachers years after she left the district. And she just wrote to let us know how much of an impact these high school teachers had. And one thing that stands out is that I'm always amazed every senior year when kids are applying to college, the extra or the work that the staff has to put in, writing letters of recommendation for the seniors. So here is a girl who's applying to grad school now, 4 years after graduating from Marlboro High School, and in the email she says, you know, her college professors are great, but she reached out to two of the teachers who I had just mentioned, and these teachers took time out of their private lives 4 years after the student graduated to help her with supplemental essays and grad school applications. So I just wanted to pass this on, recognize these two teachers, and you know, and when I responded to her, I told her that from personal experience, I could certainly appreciate what she's saying, and I told her that 40 years after she graduates, she's still gonna, you know, think so highly of these teachers, and I just wanted to pass that on. That email in particular hit home with me. So that's it. That's the new business from
Thank
me.
you so much for sharing that. Okay.
Mr. Bruno,
Yes.
can I add something?
Sure.
I don't have a New Jersey School Board Association report tonight, but I did want to say to all the kids at Howell High School, and especially those kids in the FPAC program, I went and saw the Young Frankenstein on Saturday, and it was phenomenal. I mean, it was just like, I felt like I was watching a Broadway show, and I just want to congratulate not only all the kids that were involved in the production, but all the staff and everyone that helped make that happen. And I know that I didn't make it to the Manalapan presentation of Greece, but you know, I'll give a shout out to them. And for our Colts Neck and Freehold Township families, I see that Colts Neck is going to have this weekend, and actually tomorrow night and Saturday, they have Bye Bye Birdie. So encouraging the community to get out and support our performing students. And over at Freehold Township, again tonight, tomorrow night and Saturday, they're going to be having the production of the musical comedy Without Curtains. Or no, excuse me, the musical comedy Whodunit. called Curtains. So I'm a fan of the performing arts.
Yeah.
So I just want to give a shout out to all the kids and all the administrators and staff and everybody that make those shows possible. They're really excellent.
Well, to know that I did get a chance to see that last Friday, and very professional and enjoyable, and my daughter and granddaughter especially enjoyed it as well. It was very exciting.
Okay. May I have a motion to adjourn tonight?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Meeting adjourned.